Welcome, everybody. I'm Anne Burroughs. It's so wonderful to see so many of you back with us for our commemoration of the 30th anniversary of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, when the President of this country had the courage to name the injustice of the incarceration for what it was, to reaffirm the principles on which this great country was founded, and to issue an apology for the great wrong that it had wrought its own citizens. But it also marks the extraordinary efforts of Japanese Americans from every walk of life who mobilized and fought for redress and fought for that apology and the acknowledgement of that grave injustice. So we at the museum have embarked on sort of almost like it's a week of activities. Today, obviously, is our event commemorates the actual anniversary. But our commemorations actually began this weekend with the opening of a new display in the final gallery of Common Ground, which we've called Reaffirmed Commitment. And this was the product of an extraordinary co-curated effort by Maki, who's the president and CEO of Go for Broke, and our own John Isaki. And John, where are you? Mitch in the foreground, John is sitting in the back. You'll hear from Mitch later in the program. So among the special things that you'll see on display are 2 original pages of the Civil Liberties Act. These include the actual page that bears President Reagan's signature, as well as those of Senator Spark Matsunaga and JANM's chair of the Board of Trustees, Norm Mineta. And these documents are on loan to us from the National Archives. We'll have them with us until towards the end of September. So I really would encourage those who haven't visited this display to do so. You will also see in the display case alongside this document the actual pen that President Reagan used to sign the act. But also in that display, you won't just see the product of the work. You'll also see film. You'll see film, you'll hear the voices, and you'll read the testimony of ordinary people who testified at the commissions and who spoke out with a strong and unified voice. So it's a privilege for me that we've been able to gather all of you together today under the same roof, where together we can all affirm the commitment and the sheer collective will of an entire community that stood up to ensure that the Japanese-American experience is never forgotten and never repeated. In his remarks to us on Friday evening, Norm reminded us all of the enormous debt that we owe to Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga, who passed away on July the 18th. She was a pillar. She was a pillar in the community. I met her only at the end of her life, but so many of you in this room have walked alongside her for so many years. My own knowledge of her and my own experience of her was I was so struck by her grace, by her dignity, and her passionate commitment to fighting injustice. And for those of you in the room, we'll all reaffirm and celebrate that if it hadn't been for her work and it hadn't been for the documents that she uncovered, the Civil Liberties Act and Redress may not have happened. And we were all privileged at our most recent gala to have been able to have Aiko on stage with us to receive JANM's Award of Excellence. She was certainly an inspiration to all of us. So Norm has also asked me to read to you from some of the remarks that he gave at an event at JANM last weekend. And I think given what we'd want to do with our program this afternoon, I think that they're very apt. Norm said, "We owe a debt to the hundreds of people who were courageous enough to give their testimony in front of the Commission. Many of these former prisoners had never before publicly shared their experience. Had it not been for these individuals and so many others awakening the conscience of the Commission and our nation, President Reagan may not ever have signed the seminal law. I'm also reminded that we must remain vigilant in pushing back against a social and political atmosphere that seeks to marginalize people. Today, when I look out across the political landscape, I see images and rhetoric that harken back to the dangerous and racist thinking of the 1940s that allowed for the creation of America's concentration camps. If the thoughts behind current efforts like the travel ban and zero tolerance border policy are allowed to continue unanswered, then over time the hard-fought battles of 30 years ago erode and our democracy is diminished. Organizations like the Japanese American National Museum and others act daily to push back against ignorance, to stand with those unfairly targeted and ensure that future generations know the Japanese American experience. It's because all of you who push back, who push on us at the museum and allow us here to do our work so that the lessons of the past are never forgotten. So for me, as I said earlier, it's profoundly moving to have all of us under the same roof together with that document that commemorates the 30th anniversary and all that it represents. And also, particularly on this anniversary that could not have more relevance or immediacy at this moment, when the democratic and human rights of so many in this country are threatened. And our obligation collectively, certainly our obligation at the museum, is to shine a light on what can happen when any community is scapegoated and persecuted. That urgency, or that commitment, that task could not be more urgent. So our program today, Japanese American Redress, A Promise for the Future, I hope will weave all of this together. And our primary speakers, I think, will share very compelling remarks with you. The first is Mitch Maki, the president and CEO of Go for Broke, who needs no introduction. The second is Karen Wang, who's the executive director of UCLA Law's David J. Epstein Program in Public Interest Law and Policy. And prior to that, she was a vice president of programs and communications at Asian Americans Advancing Justice and has a very extensive background in social justice issues. And at the end of the formal part of our program, we'll have about a 30-minute segment where we'll invite those of you who were actually involved in redress, who lived that, who walked that together, to come up from the floor to share very brief remarks about what redress meant to you. And Alan Nishio has very kindly agreed to kick that segment off and to make sure that you all hold to a 2-minute time frame. And the reason we're asking you to do that is that we want to be able to gather everybody together who was involved in redress to have a photograph, a joint photograph, and then all of us together to be together to have another photograph, to recommit to the future and what we need to do. And also give us time to mingle, and for those of you who haven't seen the gallery, to go upstairs to take a look. And we have a hard stop. Everything has to close at 5 p.m. because that's when the Tanabata Festival opens, and that's when we all turn back into pumpkins. So with that, I'm going to call Mitch, who's been such a strong partner for us in all of our activities. So Mitch, it's over to you.
Thank you, Anne. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, come on, folks. It's the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Civil Liberties Act. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Okay. You know, as I was walking in and I saw everybody coming in, I realized that this room right now really is a who's who of people that were involved in the redress movement in Southern California. We have friends from the JACL. Come on, David, you can smile. Ron, where are you back there? We can smile now today. We have friends from NCRR. Alan Nishio, Mia is here, Kay is here, Richard Katsuda is here. And I know that there are many of us here who marched on the streets of Little Tokyo in candlelight marches during that time. And there are others here who marched in the halls of Congress to lobby for this bill. So it is really a gathering of people who care deeply about this issue. And yet I'm also reminded that there are so many that are not here with us. As Anne mentioned, Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga is not here with us today. William Horry is not here with us today. Bert and Lillian Nakano are not here with us today, and Grace Uehara are just some of the few community activists who are not here with us any longer, but are here with us in spirit. And I also think of our legislators, Senators Inoue and Matsunaga, Representatives Matsui, who helped to make this bill a reality. So I think it's very appropriate at this moment if we could take a moment of silence and remember those that have gone before us who made today possible. So please join me. Thank you. But the people that we really need to thank in this room for the passage of the bill and for our community being what it is today are those traditional Issei who are no longer with us, but also the traditional Nisei who were in camp. And so I'd like to take this moment and ask if there are any folks here today that were in camp or were forcibly excluded from the West Coast. If you're able, please stand and be recognized. And you know, there's a subcategory of this group that I, as the president of Go for Broke National Education Center, need to acknowledge. And those were the young men who chose to fight for this nation, even at a time when our nation had turned its back on them today. And I know that there's at least one of them here today, but if you are a veteran of World War II, please stand or wave your hand, Don, if you can, Mr. Don Secchi. When we think about what has transpired, I know that I am just so full of pride. Pride in our story, pride in our community, and pride in our nation. This is a story of how a young, small, disenfranchised community was the victim of one of the most egregious violations of our Constitution, and years later found the strength and the voice to say, we were wronged, we are deserving of an apology. It's a story of how a community goes from saying shikata ganai to justice delayed is justice denied. And it's a story of how a community goes from seeing what happened to it as a social misfortune to understanding it as a political injustice that was imposed upon them. It's a wonderful story that we as a community and we as a nation need to embrace. And the story starts back in 1942, as nearly 120,000 individuals of Japanese descent are forcibly excluded from the West Coast and incarcerated in camps across the United States. We lost our homes, we lost our jobs, we lost our communities. But most of all, what we lost was our sense of place at the American table of citizenship. And from that emerged an incredible story of young men who said, we will still fight for this nation. We will still go and prove that we are Americans. Why did they do that? Why did the men of the 100th, the 442nd, and the MIS put their lives in harm's way despite what happened to their families? Well, I think the best answer is that of a young sergeant by the name of Kazuo Masuda, who, when asked, why are you doing this, answered, because this is the only way that I know that my family can have a chance in America. Right or wrong, agree with him or not, Sergeant Masuda and many of the other Nisei soldiers of World War II understood that in 1943, 1944, and 1945, loyalty needed to be demonstrated in blood. The war ends, Japanese Americans are released from camp, but there wasn't a sense immediately that we wanted to demand an apology or redress. Putting a roof over our heads, sending our children to school, reestablishing our communities was the order of the day. And for many Japanese American families, talking about that time was something that we didn't want to do. And to give you an example, in 1963 at UCLA, there was a professor named Roger Daniels, and he had a class, and one of his first assignments was for his students to write an autobiography. He had two young senseis in his class. They both started their autobiographies by saying, I was born in 1943 in Los Angeles, blah, 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 blah. Dr. Daniels looked at that and said, there's a problem here. He called them both into his office and he said, there's a problem with your autobiographies. And they looked at him and said, we didn't cheat, Dr. Daniels. I mean, how do you cheat on an autobiography, right? He said, that's not what I'm talking about. Go home, talk to your families. The next day, one of those students came back and said, Dr. Daniels, you're right. I was born in 1943, but not in Los Angeles. I was born in Manzanar, a concentration camp. The pain, the shame, the wanting to forget was so powerful for some Japanese American families that they didn't tell their own children about where they had been born or raised in those years during World War II. Fast forward now 20 years, and we're at the commission hearings, where many Japanese Americans, some for the very first time, are telling their story before this federal commission. The community comes out and supports these individuals to tell their story. And for many of them, it was not an easy thing to do. And I think this is best captured by the testimony of a man named Kiyoshi Sonoda. Kiyoshi Sonoda was a dentist, and he testified that because he had some medical training, he was put in the infirmary at his camp. And he described his first patient, a young, dehydrated infant, who he said under normal circumstances he would be able to treat and make well. But because he didn't have the proper supplies, all he could do was hold that infant in his hands and feel his last twitch before he died. And as he told this story, Dr. Sonoda had tears streaming down his face. And in the audience, his wife was sitting there, and she's saying, Kiyoshi is crying. Kiyoshi doesn't cry. Kiyoshi didn't even cry at his own father's funeral. But on that day, Dr. Sonoda did cry. And a community of Japanese Americans and a community of Americans who love justice cried with him. And we found our voice. It took 3 sessions of Congress for us to get that bill on the floor of the House. September 17th, 1987, the bill hits the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, an unprecedented bill asking our nation to apologize for an egregious wrong. 243 representatives voted in favor of this bill. 180 of them Democrats, 63 of them Republicans. Truly a bipartisan effort. 7 months later, it goes to the Senate, and we knew it would be a slam dunk there because Senator Spark Matsunaga, a former member of that 100th Battalion, twice wounded in battle, given the Bronze Star, had arranged for 71 co-sponsors to carry that bill. And it passed the Senate floor in April 1988. So now we needed just one more supporter, one more person to say, I will sign on, and that was the President of the United States. And for those of you who remember 1988, the President was Ronald Reagan, a very conservative president whose own administration had been fighting against this bill both in the House, the Senate, and in the courts. Many of us, and I have to admit, myself included, felt that there was no way on God's green earth that Ronald Reagan was going to sign this bill. But many people that are in this room today believed that we had to push on and that we had to get him to sign. The thing about Ronald Reagan was, whether you agreed with his policies or not, most people would agree that he was a great communicator, someone who could tell a story and in doing so, moves people's hearts. The opposite was true of Ronald Reagan. If you could tell him a story that would touch his heart, you could have a great advocate on your hands. The question was, what story could we tell Ronald Reagan? Well, remember I told you about Sergeant Kazuo Masuda, the soldier that said that this was the only way that he knew that his family could have a chance in America. 2 weeks after saying that, Sergeant Masuda was killed in battle, fighting for his nation, the United States of America. After the war, his family moves back to their home in Santa Ana, California, and they're met with racism. They're met with threats of bodily violence, and they're told to leave and get out because their kind was not wanted. The Army realizes that this is a PR fiasco and sends out a contingent of Army officers to have a medal ceremony for the Masuda family. And that evening, at a convention dinner, there was a young white American captain named Ronald Reagan. And he read these words to the family of Kazuo Masuda. He said, "The blood that is soaked into the sands is all of one color. America stands unique in the world, the only country not founded on race, but on an ideal. Mr. and Mrs. Masuda, as one member of the American family to another, for what your son Kazuo did, thanks." That story was relayed to President Reagan, and his response was, "I remember that family, and I remember what those soldiers did for America." On August 10th, 1988, 30 years ago today, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act. And in doing so, he said, "Here we right a grave wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law. The ideals of liberty and justice, it is still the American way." It was a great moment for our community. It was a greater moment for our nation. But before we end today, before we leave thinking that justice is secured, let me remind you of the words of the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, who before he died said, "The Korematsu decision was wrong, but you are kidding yourself if you think it will never happen again. In times of war, the laws fall silent." In times of war, the laws fall silent. So as we gather here today to remember, to commemorate and celebrate the passage of this wonderful piece of legislation, let us also reaffirm our commitment that never again in our nation, whether in times of war or in times of peace, will we let our laws fall silent. Thank you for being here today. Thank you. I was just about to say, I've been asked to introduce our next speaker, and there's no notes up here. But then the notes appear, so thank you, Liz. So we're very fortunate to be joined today by Karen Wang, who is the Executive Director of the David J. Epstein Program in Public Interest Law and Policy at UCLA School of Law, a unique specialization that trains the next generation of public interest lawyers. Prior to joining UCLA, Wang advocated for civil rights and immigrant rights for more than 20 years. She was the longtime Vice President of Programs and Communication at Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Los Angeles, and also launched and ran the Los Angeles Civil Rights Field Office of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Karen Wang.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes. Can you see me? You might not be able to see me. I apologize. Did not wear heels today. It's such a pleasure to be here and actually quite an honor. I think you can tell from my name, I am myself not Japanese American, but I've worked in the Los Angeles Asian American community for a long time. Obviously, I'm very familiar with a lot of the Japanese American community. I married into a Japanese American community, and so my children, this is part of their heritage. So it's actually quite an honor to be here amongst many of the leaders of this community over the decades, and thank you for having me here. I have a slight embarrassing thing to admit before I make the rest of my comments, which is I actually operated on the assumption for several weeks that I was actually going to be on a panel and someone was going to ask me questions, and I did not have to script myself in advance. And then thankfully I looked at my notes that actually this is my fault completely. It was not the fault of the folks organizing. And when I realized actually I was going to have to come up here and actually speak and follow very eloquent comments. So I'm saying that to ask for your forgiveness. So my comments will not be quite as passionate and lucid. But I am very honored to be here because I do, I actually thought was interesting, part of my own reflection and kind of looking into the history of the redress for today was that in 1988, I was graduating from high school then, and a lot of my own political education and activism as a young person actually started right around that time. So actually, the whole redress movement in the 10 years leading up to the signing by President Reagan actually sort of preceded my own kind of coming to know the Asian American civil rights community. And I am very grateful to JANM for holding this event, for all of you for being here. I actually think, from what I was reading last night, just about the incredible campaign that was so well thought out, the number of people involved on so many fronts in organizing. I mean, so much had to be done. You had to have Japanese Americans in Congress to carry the ball forward. You had to have the organizing on the ground. You needed the storytelling that I think was done very deliberately through public education. I understand the commission that was created was very deliberate in terms of forcing the story out into the public, to have testimony given, to have a record created that really didn't exist. And so there's so much to learn from that movement that I actually hope that we find a way to tell this story as inspiration for, not just the younger generations in the Japanese American community who would not know this history. But even Asian Americans like myself, I was embarrassed to realize I spent 20 years working on Asian American civil rights in Los Angeles and actually really didn't know the full history of redress other than that Reagan had signed it and that it had given reparations to those who were alive at the time. And there's so much rich history there, and on top of that, there's so many Americans in general who really should know what a remarkable campaign and accomplishment the redress was. So I just wanted to start out by saying I'm so grateful for this opportunity. We must find a way to share this campaign, this story, this history with a much broader audience. So my thoughts are just a couple. I really wanted to say a few things about, sort of where we are today, tie it to kind of what I'm doing now in terms of building a new generation of public service, public interest-minded lawyers, but also just some lessons that I, as someone who was not involved in the redress movement, draw in terms of my own civil rights background. I don't think I need to tell people in the room that we are in a very unique moment in history, and we're in an uncharted time, quite honestly, in terms of historically, politically in the United States, and particularly since November 2016. Over the past year and a half or so, the current president and the administration have rolled out a number of unconstitutional and inhumane policies, in particular, but not exclusively, targeting refugees, immigrants, Muslims, people who are vulnerable, things that I think many of you who lived through internment or the redress fight probably thought during the Obama era. I certainly thought this, that we had turned a corner, that we were progressing, that we were not going to see these dark days again. But now on a daily basis, and when I was working at Advancing Justice, I felt like every day I'd wake up and my first instinct would be to check Twitter to see what had happened, because there was going to be some new drama or danger to our rights that we would have to address, that was going to change the course of my week, my day, my month. So on a daily basis, our fundamental rights and principles of democracy are under threat. You all can probably name more than me, but just a handful of things. Journalists now being attacked for doing their very jobs of fact-finding, trying to hold elected officials or corporate leaders accountable for their words, for their actions. We have voters who are being suppressed and turned away at the polls. Not coincidentally, I think, voters who are from poor communities, voters who are not white, maybe less so in California, although it's not not an issue here, but voters who, because of very strict ID laws about who is allowed to actually cast a ballot on election day, people who have been purged off of lists, who show up and are told, actually, you don't seem to be a voter, sorry, this is happening right now in our country. And even, a lot of people don't know this, but in the Asian American communities, we see, when I worked at Advancing Justice, we saw the issue of bilingual ballot access as actually a voter suppression issue, because you actually have a right to vote regardless of whether you're fluent in English. And in places like LA County, there are access to the ballot in multiple languages, but that is not always provided. And in places outside of California, you can imagine that immigrants, non-English speakers, pretty much don't vote or have a very hard time doing so. This is happening now every day on a regular basis. And the government, unfortunately, particularly the federal government, is in many ways now, I think many Japanese Americans, particularly those of you who stood up and said, I was in camp, the government is now, it is no longer a friend of the people, it has now become the enemy of the people, of so many people. And for the work that I've done for 20 years, it is the people that I and my colleagues worked with that were the most targeted. The immigrants and even citizens are being swept up in deportation and detention, so you don't even, you could have been born here, but if you don't look like it, or you're not the kind of assumed American, like what people think is an American, these people are being deported and detained. Asylum seekers, literally babies and parents, as you all know, because this has been in the news ad nauseum the last few weeks, are being separated and traumatized without any sort of due process. Things that we have guaranteed in our Constitution are being, ignored. Refugees escaping violence that honestly our country has helped to create in other parts of the world are now being turned away at our borders, being told, we have no room for you, we don't want you, we don't care for you anymore. Muslims in particular are being surveilled and harassed, criminalized, really just for existing. I think this is something many Japanese Americans in particular have resonated with. We've seen post 9/11 that your mere existence by definition has made you an enemy, and that is happening again. And then even within the Asian American community, because I hear many of my Asian American colleagues saying, like the Trump administration hasn't come after us, they come after everyone else. I'm not going to repeat that famous saying, like, you go down the list and eventually they're going to come for you. But I will also say that, like, just in this past week, Trump has been the president's been calling out China and Chinese, for example, very explicitly, accusing people of Chinese background of being spies, for example. So the most recent news headline was him saying that all students, Chinese students from China, were here just as spies, like just unilaterally. And all of us in this room probably know, like, that's not true, but, my fear is that, the average non-Asian, even the average Asian, can't tell who is a Chinese student, who is not. B, that statement is absolutely false, and the president should not be saying that. But what it creates is this climate of fear. All of these people being othered and being set up as the enemy by the government puts all of us at risk and danger. So it's a pretty sad and scary time. I will say what has been interesting, and one of the reasons I'm doing what I'm doing now at UCLA, is that there's an interesting silver lining over the last 2 years, year and a half. And these assaults and threats on our values and identity as a nation and a community have actually really galvanized an incredible response from a lot of people who I think felt complacent. And honestly, I think I was one of those people, like, under 8 years of the Obama administration and living in California, you tend to get complacent. You think, there are bad things. We need to change a lot of things. Things were not perfect under the prior administration, but I don't think most of us thought they could be where they are now. And now, because the reality is what it is, there is a huge spike in political engagement. I think you cannot open the newspaper right now any day without hearing about the midterms and people becoming engaged and running for office who actually 6 months ago or a year ago would never have thought about that, let alone going out and voting, right? But in the legal side, I will just share, the impact on law schools has been tremendous. Over the past year, as we've been seeing these stories play out the news, what I think is interesting as someone who grew up only hearing basically lawyer jokes or seeing this kind of Hollywood version of lawyers as these corporate people who were always having all these like dramas and working in fancy law offices in downtown LA. LA law, was really big when I was growing up. I mean, that was what people thought lawyers were. And I actually, one thing I'm grateful for is in this past year to 2 years is to see, every day in the news, the presence of public interest lawyers, people who are working for the ACLU, for National Immigration Law Center, for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, for legal aid, people in the government like the state attorney general, general's offices across, there's 4 or 5 state attorney generals who have been bringing lawsuits challenging laws and policies they think are harming the environment, harming immigrants, harming people who are poor. And so actually what's been really great is that there's a huge bump in people thinking, I need to be engaged in public service, I need to run for office, I need to vote. The law schools, actually, we're seeing a huge drop in people going to law school after the recession, and 2 years ago, or about a year ago, they started turning around. And I run a public interest program at UCLA that specifically recruits and brings in law students who want to go work in government and public interest opportunities. And law school applications are up about 9 or 10% overall in the last 2 years. Public interest application for us has jumped 50%. We've gone from 300 some applicants to 500 competing for 25 spots. So on the one hand, we have to turn away a lot of people who really are passionate about it. On the other hand, it is so gratifying to me to see that people understand that we are at a moment in time when we're being called to service, to serve the public, to serve the greater good. And I am excited to be in a place to kind of, encourage and bring in more of these young people to do that very work. And I will close by just saying, some of the lessons learned. So not everyone should be a lawyer. And actually, I would say we do need more public interest lawyers, but really we don't need more lawyers, right? We need more organizers, we need more people who are journalists and doing all these other great things, to ensure that what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II, the incarceration, doesn't happen again. It's probably not going to, if it happens, it's not going to happen exactly the same way, but it will, in the end, be the same thing. Somebody will be demonized and targeted, and their rights will be stripped from them, and we will, the worst case scenario is we all sit here and go, oh, well, because of war, because of enemies and fear, that's okay. So that's what we all need to fight against, and I think the Japanese American experience has so many great lessons. So I will say just maybe 3 of them. There's so many, but the 3 for me that stand out is that, and that I see many of my Japanese American friends and leaders do, is that number one, we must keep talking about the past and the mistakes that have been made, because quite honestly, even the Korematsu case has not been officially overturned. Yes, we got super close in one of the recent Supreme Court decisions where basically what lawyers would call dicta, basically, in a comment in another decision on something else, it was referenced that essentially is bad law. But until that case is overturned, until we have the Supreme Court rules on this issue, it's still out there. It still is not bad law. So we've made mistakes as a country, and we have not fully rectified them, and that we need to keep talking about it. And I will say, many of you might remember this. Do folks remember, and I don't know if anyone's here from the LA Times, but last year, I think a year ago, the LA Times unfortunately ran some letters to the editor that were written by people essentially justifying internment. Does anyone remember that? I know a lot of us wrote back in response, and I will just say that shows how easy it is to create and accept justifications for outrageous actions, especially the further we get away from the event that happened, right? I mean, it was shocking to me to see that, and I was one of many people, probably half of you in this room wrote in and just said, that is unbelievable that you published this without, any context, without, I remember one of the comments was, well, Japanese Americans were incarcerated for their own protection, because if they'd been left alone, like in California, they would have been victims of violence or whatever. That's outrageous that was allowed to stand unchallenged. So we have so much to do. We have to keep talking, because even though many of you feel like you've been doing this for decades and people should know better by now, we're seeing right now people don't know better, and that some people have never even heard these stories, right? So that's one. We have to keep talking, and I think people like myself who didn't live through it, we need to carry that mantle forward. Number 2, we have to fight on all fronts to win. And what I loved about the Redress example that really spoke to me, working at a legal organization that embraced more than just a strictly legal strategy, is that I think the Redress movement only succeeded because it moved on so many fronts. There was legal actions that were happening, both the quorum nobis cases that were trying to overturn the individual convictions, as well as I understand there was a lawsuit that was actually trying to challenge, to kind of through the legal system force the redress. There was the congressional actions, there was the storytelling through the commission and the testimony, gaining media coverage, forcing the issue into the public eye. That is an amazing long-term strategy. It took years, multiple years, probably longer than anybody working on it wanted, I'm guessing. But there is so much we have to learn there, because I feel like, even as a lawyer, one of my messages to the public interest lawyers that we're training is, you might have come here thinking you're going to be that ACLU lawyer going to the Supreme Court arguing that pivotal case, but the reality is that case doesn't get there there on its own. There was a media strategy to humanize the plaintiff in the case, to tell the story of the community, before we could even get to that point. Many people who follow what happened with marriage equality know that but for what was happening on the public opinion side in terms of shifting how people as a whole felt about gay and lesbian couples and marriage for them, the Supreme Court probably wouldn't have come down the way it did when it did a couple of years ago. So we have to fight on all fronts to win, and I think the Redress case to me is a beautiful example of how that was done. And then finally, I would say one thing that I feel like I'm reminded of daily now is that we have to refuse to be complacent or complicit. And I would say, Asian Americans, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, we all have to do this. It's so easy to slide into complacency even right now. I think that Japanese Americans have actually been, amongst the Asian Americans, the best in terms of putting this into practice. I think since 9/11, I have seen more Japanese Americans step to the forefront and speak, in partnership with and on behalf of the Muslim community than any other community. I see a lot of Asian Americans, quite honestly, saying, not my community, not my issue, but I think because of the experiences of Japanese Americans, that message is not the one the community carries forward. But it is something that I think, in general, beyond the Muslim community issue, I think we have to challenge it, whether it's something like the Muslim ban or, quite honestly, we're not all lawyers. Like, even I can't get up and file a case in the Supreme Court. I don't have the skills or the background to do that. But we should challenge things as simple as the use of racist terminology. I think when you see things like those LA Times letters, like, people might feel like, oh my God, someone else is going to write. That's ridiculous. I'm going to post on Facebook and complain about it. But honestly, like, LA Times heard from so many people that they had to essentially retract and apologize to the extent I think that they could or would. I mean, it was probably not perfect, but it was better than we've seen some other media do, where they just deny that they made a mistake altogether. And I will say something even as simple as, I've actually, Facebook is, and many of you may not be on Facebook because you are my parents' generation, and my dad's only on Facebook to see his grandkids. He doesn't know how to do anything else on Facebook. But I will say, I see a lot of my friends debating things on Facebook, and I struggle with whether social media is the right platform to have debates. But I was in an interesting online conversation with people about the term Oriental recently, which, to be honest, since I was a young kid growing in the Midwest, hadn't given that much thought to that term. It's a term I hate every time I hear it, even if I see the word Oriental rug or Oriental restaurant. I just kind of cringe, and I'm not going to go patronize that restaurant, but I'm not going to deal with it. But I actually called out somebody for using it because they were saying it was okay to say Oriental rugs, Oriental food, Oriental medicine, but not to call a person Oriental. And I said, thank you for saying, there's no Oriental people. But the same rationale that applies to there is no Oriental people, because Orient is not a real thing. It is a figment of European imagination. It was created to kind of paint the entire region east of Western Europe as one kind of foreign whole. I mean, it covers everything from Turkish carpets to Chinese, acupuncture. And, it actually was this really interesting, it ended up being this interesting conversation with a number of people about, I had no idea that actually saying that to an Asian person actually, even though you're not going to, jump down my throat about it, it makes you feel bad. It makes you feel like, I'm othering you and I'm treating you as something different and as not fully American. And so I would just say, even if it's something as simple as that, we have to think about where in our lives are we complicit or complacent to issues of racism or anti-immigrant, nativism that is sweeping the nation right now. And we can all do small things, whether it's small as that or, getting involved in larger campaigns, going to the airport when people are being barred from entering from other countries. So I will just leave you kind of with that last thought. And the thing I'll say in closing is I really love the idea of using this 30th anniversary to recommit to the fight for justice. And I hope everyone signs the banner and makes a personal commitment in whatever way is meaningful to you, because we only have equal justice when we all have justice. So thank you.
Well, you're not going to have me stand behind the podium and give a long speech, so don't worry. But as Anne had mentioned, this last part of the program, really, when you look at the people that are here and what Redress represented, it was a movement of our community fighting for justice. And I think we want to capture that portion. And so what Anne had asked me to do was to kind of just start off kind of an open mic session, to be able to allow individuals that were present during that time to share any stories or memories that you might have that would be particularly relevant, but to keep it within a relatively short timeline. So Anne has asked me to start it off for two reasons. One is it forces me to keep my comments within 2 minutes. And if you know me, 2 minutes is like nothing. I can't even get my first joke out in 2 minutes, let alone. But no, but really, because of this, we do want to make it participatory, but also be able to allow different people to speak and give those kind of their memories of that time. And I'm giving you some time to think about any things that you may want to share. The other reason I think that she asked me to do it is usually amongst a Nikkei crowd, sometimes when you have an open mic, people don't want to get up and talk, right? And so the other reason I'm up here is the threat that unless people come up, I'm going to just keep talking. And so you're going to get another reprise of a speech of mine unless people start nudging me off to be able to share the mic. But really, I think the museum is doing this really to make this more participatory. The way the format was set up, you could see that Mitch helped set the significance of redress. And Karen talked about how it ain't over and the significance of it today. And I think for many of us, and I look at the folks around here, and we know that it's not over. And while this is a significant anniversary to celebrate, this is not the time to rest on our laurels. It's the time to celebrate, to remember what we had and what we did then, but remember why we did it. And to understand the why is as important, if not more so today, than it was 30 years ago. So I think that's what's important for us to kind of reconsider those things. Okay, now I'm going to give my comment, and then I'm hoping others of you will stand up and give your comments. And so my 2 minutes starts now, so don't count that preamble. That was all kind of, I got my joke in there, I got every, that's, No, but seriously, for me, it's just a thought. 30 years ago today, actually about this time, I was in Washington, D.C., where a number of us had been invited to go to the White House to be part of the signing ceremony. And I think we had been given, 3 days notice or something like that. I can't remember. It was not a lot of notice to be able to say, all right, would you like to come to Washington, D.C.? We expect the signing, but we're not sure. But, and so I said, yes. I caught a red eye that night, got in the morning, and it was it was kind of a surreal environment because, one, I was even surprised that the White House security let me into the White House because, if you knew me and Ronald Reagan, you know that I was not going to be a real fan there. But beyond that, when you looked at the people there, it was very nice. It was a nice assemblage, and many of you in this room were there at that time, of community organizations, elected officials, and others that were there. And so there was a nice mix of people. But the grassroots part of me felt there are so many people that are not there that should be there. And that rather than the folks that were there, the elected officials who are used to this is just another signature thing, a photo op, you do this thing, you move on. For many others, this was such an important occasion. And I was thinking of those that, Burton O'Connell was there, a few of us from NCRR are there. But I was thinking of the others that were the core of NCRR. The Dave Imamuras, the Tom Shiroishis, the Jim Saitos, the gardeners, truck drivers, utility workers that were the backbone of the redress movement. That they're the ones that should be able to be there and raise a fist and say, yes, justice has been served, and a committed group of individuals can indeed change the course of justice. And so for me, that was my story, and I hope it's under 2 minutes. But I would invite others to share any comments or memories that you may want to share. And the other reason they asked me to do this is I know a lot of you, so I can actually call out names too. And you don't want me to call out names. Well, I wasn't going to call you Phil, so I'm saying, no. Go ahead.
Been sitting here thinking about what I might say. Let me start from the beginning. Back in April of 1975, Paul Tsaneishi in the San Fernando Valley had an idea for following up on what Raymond Uno had proposed at the National Convention starting as early as 1968. We had a panel. We had about 200 people there. We had Raymond Uno, who came down from San Francisco. Unfortunately, one of the panelists was Masamune Kojima, who was PSW JCL regional director. He was opposed. He said, we don't have time for this. We just have to do other things. Very disappointing. We did get EO 9066 Incorporated started, made up of people who were deliberately chosen from people who were not JCL people, because we knew JCL had a bad reputation amongst a large group of people in the community. So we respected that. Paul was really diligent. We got incorporated. We got Sue Embry from the Manzanar Committee involved. We got churches who signed on. It was wonderful. Paul got himself as regional director for JCL in '78. He got in there, he started writing letters to other JCL regional directors. He got one response. The person was angry. He says, why are you bringing this up now? We have no business into something like this. This is too controversial. So that taught him that by and large, it was something the establishment, older JCL people did not want to get involved in. And that was unfortunate. It was the younger people. It was people like Alan and NCRR people, the people who were coming up, who took the ball and carried it. And it was wonderful to see. I think we have reflections of that today. We have young people now who are willing to step up and do the things that need to be done. And we need to capitalize on them. We have the young people from the past as our examples, and we need to educate the young people in our communities together to take up from where we've left off and advocate to see that similar injustices don't occur to other groups we all know about. Thank you.
Anyone else like to? Okay, Richard.
Just thinking about what I think Redress is all about, and I think it's about making our community whole again, healthy again. And so I think 30 years is the marker, but I think it's very clear that, well, what I want maybe to get back to earlier, maybe 40 years ago and all, is thinking about where the community was at and how there was such a hush in the community, and that it took people to start opening up a bit, and it needed some internal churning. And I was reminded of this first house meeting that we did in San Jose when I was in San Jose during the early days. And there was a Nisei gentleman who was about 16, 17 during the war, at the outbreak of the war. And he opened up his comments during the house meeting saying, yeah, I had a good time, good times in camp. It's like fun, we had dances, all that kind of thing. And it took a while for people to open up, because at the beginning people said, this was the first time for a lot of people to come together, even talk about what had happened during World War II. And so people started slowly opening up. And one thing is, I think we started around 7 o'clock, and people said, we don't have anything to say. But I think we went on to about midnight, and I think it could have gone on. But to get back to this gentleman, he talked about how, yeah, I had a good time. But during the course of the evening, you could see something going on within him because he was talking about some things, and then you could tell there was some agitation when he talked about this brand new pickup truck that he had to give up. And so we first talked about it, and as the evening progressed, he kept bringing it up. And by the end of the evening, he was all mad, all churned up, and saying, "Man, I had to give up this brand new pickup," and all of this stuff. So it just showed in the course of one evening what can happen to a person who said, "Oh no, I had a great time," to really pissed off. So I think it showed that there needs to be a lot of internal churning. Because I think a lot of us, I wasn't there, but I think a lot of what I grew up in was kind of an externalization of how a lot of people are holding things in and saying, "Hey, don't make waves, don't do this, don't do that." But I think it requires still a lot of internal churning, and I feel that even in the community today, that there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of getting at a lot of the scapegoating that Japanese Americans did to fellow Japanese Americans. And I wanted to say that I wanted to also remind people that Yosh Kuromiya just passed away. And he was, of course, one of the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee members. And, big fighter, and he stood up for what he believed in. But I think still today, because there's still a lot of a vacuum about what happened to people like that, what happened to the no-nos, renunciants, who are still being scapegoated, castigated, whatever you want to call it. And I think that there needs to be a lot of that still happening. That 30 years of CLA, that's very important to mark that point, but we have a lot of stuff to do, I feel, before we really say that, we're really coming around in terms of redress.
And if any of you would like to speak, please just come up and wait here rather than having me bouncing back and forth. Go ahead.
I want to thank two groups of people. I was 10 years old when the government thought I was a spy and put me in a concentration camp. The first group I would like to thank is the men and women who fought for us during World War II. And before I became a volunteer here, long before that, I heard about a friend. He told me, she says, I graduated from UCLA with an engineering degree. I could not get a job. I had to work in the produce market. So when they asked for volunteers with a 442, I volunteered. Now, at that time, I was smaller than this, but he was shorter than I am. He weighed less than I did. What he was one of those guys that ate a lot to go take the physical, and when he took the height, there was a minimum height, he stood on his toes, and he passed. And he said to me, after fighting for the 442, coming back, he went to ask for a job in the aircraft plant. You know what? He got a job. So I learned a long time ago that the men and women who fought for us during World War II opened the doors for people like me. So I want to thank, like Don and all the men of the 10442, MIS, and the women too. And at one time, when we're talking about one of the exhibits, Joe Ito's exhibit here, and I mentioned that, did you know that many of the men that fought were 18 and 19 years old? One of the staff members started to cry because she didn't know that. Okay? Now, the second group I want to thank is people like Joe Nagano there, and people at NCRR. I want to thank them, because people like myself and my age, we were not activists. I am not an activist, but I have to thank them, all of you who fought for us to get redress and an apology. So I want to say, domo arigato.
I've changed my mind about 10 times about what I would say in my 2 minutes, so I better get going. But I want to just start with a context that I was the shyest kid growing up in San Diego. Who wouldn't realize that after all these years I would become kind of loud, yakamashi? But it's because of the redress movement, really. I think that we grew up in a time back in the 50s where we were kind of like flying under the radar. Because of what had happened during the war, poor self-image, my parents did not want us to go to Nihon Gakko. We didn't do a lot to embrace the culture. So given that context of where we were at and all the silence, what happened at the commission hearings was totally life-changing. I think that cannot be, stated enough. To learn our history, to begin to learn our history, and then with the Civil Liberties Act, to have the education fund, which funded more stories, more films, more plays, music about our experience. And it's continued, it's kind of increased. We have more of a history to embrace. And I think it has contributed to, what I feel now is pretty loud and pretty proud to be Japanese American. And I think that's probably my greatest takeaway of having worked in the redress movement. But before I forget, I want to pay tribute not just to Aiko and Yosh and former Congressman Ron Dellums. You can see his floor speech on YouTube. It's one of the best. Also to, oh my gosh, I wanted to pay tribute to someone else who just recently passed away. But let me just say, besides, thank you, Art Shibayama, who was a Japanese Latin American, and that's a whole nother 15 minutes, which I won't take, about the Japanese Latin Americans. Just to remind you that Art, although offered a settlement by the government of $5,000, which he turned down, he and his brothers turned it down, he continued to fight for, social justice, his due justice. He did not see justice. He unfortunately passed away about 2 weeks ago. But there were so many heroes that we met during the redress movement that contributed to who we are today. And I think that it's the regular folks too, like, Lily Okamoto, Bernadette Nishimoto, all the people that we worked with side by side through the whole redress movement. And then also in 1990, after the first checks were going out, we met a lot more people who were denied redress. And that's a whole nother wonderful group of people. And through all those people who were turned down for redress that we struggled with, I had the good fortune of meeting and working with Michi Weglin, whose book changed my life too. She worked so hard. I think that there are so many wonderful stories that create our history that I could talk forever, so I'll stop right now. Thank you.
I'll be brief. My name is Pauline Yoshihashi, and my dad is one of our veterans. He was a 100th replacement. And I am here, as I often am, to speak for my dad and my parents. And my dad didn't speak. He acted. He was drafted out of camp. He and his brother served in Europe. And I was one of the fortunate sansei. My parents talked about redress. My grandparents told me about camp. So I think the reason I decided to become a journalist, which is what I was during the redress movement, was because of their experiences. So because I was a journalist, given ethics laws, at major newspapers, I was at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, but I followed it. And I did the only thing that I could do, which was to write. And when redress finally passed, it was in 1988, and I was a young reporter at the Wall Street Journal. And I said, if I don't write this story, it's not going to run in the Wall Street Journal, which, as you know, is a very conservative publication. So I wrote a story, and I remember meeting so many people who were in this room following the hearings. And when the story finally ran, this was in the days before the internet, I started getting letters and phone calls. And the one thing you can say about the Wall Street Journal, whether you care for it or not, is its readership tends to be very highly educated and fairly much, let's face it. It's a pretty wealthy person's newspaper. And I heard from so many people across the country who were Ivy League educated, who had the best of the best, who had every privilege that this country had to offer, and said, we had no idea that Japanese Americans were ever incarcerated in this country. And I made myself a promise at that time. And I said, because of that experience of all of these people who wrote these letters, again, people who had the best of what America had to offer, were unaware of our story. And he said, I will never allow another group to be targeted in the US the way my family was targeted. And which is one of the reasons I'm here. I volunteer with Go for Broke, as my dad does as well. But the one thing I do want to say on behalf of my family to everybody here in this room, all of the Issei who are gone, and to the Nisei who raised us, and to all of the Sansei who are active, is truly thank you and okage-sama de, because my grandparents, my grandmothers were both alive to see the reparations. And my grandmother said this could only happen in a great country. So anyway, thank you to all of the Issei and to the Nisei who raised us. We owe you so much. Thank you.
My baby arrived a month early. The doctor had delivered 3 babies and had collapsed, so he returned to his barracks for a much-needed rest. There was only one OBGYN in the entire camp. I had long, long hours of labor. I must have looked ghastly because my sister came to visit me in labor and left the room abruptly. Later, she told me I looked so awful that she went outside to vomit. After 28 hours of labor, the nurse became concerned and sent for Dr. Wakamatsu, who examined me and said, "Your baby's heartbeat is getting very faint. I will have to use forceps to deliver the baby, and I'll have to give you a local painkiller because we do not have an anesthesiologist. We can't wait any longer because we don't have a resuscitating machine to revive the baby." I remember many details in the delivery room. After using the scalpel to cut me, he picked up the forceps. I thought it looked like the ice tongs used by the Iceman, only the ends were long and flat, not curved and pointed. After much pulling, he finally got the baby out. When I saw her, I noticed a large scab on the back of her head. She has a bald spot there to this day. Madeline is a developmentally disabled person. She is mentally retarded and has grand mal epilepsy. The testimony of Mrs. Mary Oda. The Commission on Wartime Relocation, oh God, sorry. The commission hearings changed my life. The Japanese American people stood up. People that had never spoken in front of a group of people before testified in front of a presidential commission, told their story, demanded reparations, revealed secrets that they had never even told their own families. The commission hearings changed my life, and I think they changed the lives of anyone that has been able to see the tapes, and we can see from the people today how much the legacy of those people, our parents and our grandparents and our cousins and aunts and uncles and ourselves, how much of a difference we made on that day. The other important thing about Redress for me was a delegation of 141 activists who saved their money, their vacation time, and went to Washington, D.C. to lobby for the passage of the bill. And that's why I love NCRR, because we wanted to put a human face on the issue. We wanted the people to speak out. The original plan was for one hearing in Washington, D.C. with a bunch of academics and a bunch of legislative people. We demanded, NCRR demanded, we met with the president of the commission and other commissioners, and we said, you have to have these hearings in every city that has a significant Japanese American population, because these are the people who know the real story and who will be affected. And it's the voices of all those people that won Redress. Not one person, there was not one person that can claim credit for Redress. It belongs to the community. The Japanese American people stood up. Thank you, everybody.
I think that is a nice fitting conclusion to this part of the program. But I think Mia's, what you read in terms of Dr. Oda's testimony, et cetera, is something we cannot forget. What won Redress was our community's willingness to stand up and tell our story. And I think that was something that empowered our community to do so, and it was through that kind of the anxiety of first time seeing, we saw kind of that sense of shyness or insecurity turning into righteous anger and indignation. And it was that righteous anger and indignation that actually ultimately won redress for us. And so it's something we should be very proud of. And I got more than 2 minutes in, I'm sorry, but I just wanted to kind of conclude this portion of the program. And I wanted to ask Kathy Masaoka, is Kathy? To come up, who wants to make an announcement about some other activities that are related to, and she's bringing up her posse here, okay?
Of course, I'm not going to do this alone. I just wanted to say that I am very thankful to have been part of the Redress campaign, and I think that many of us were lucky to have been born at a certain time, to have, been part of, influenced by the civil rights movement, by ethnic studies, that allowed us to see what was going on and to learn. And so, it's time and place in history, and we're at another place and time and place in history now. And, I'm so very thankful that we have young people here today who also see the importance of standing up. NCR did learn, I feel a little funny talking about NCR touting it so much, but we did learn lessons about supporting others, and we took it to heart because we didn't win Redress alone. And so after 9/11, that was something that we committed ourselves to do, and to also stand for others. And I believe it's not just us as NCR, but our whole community really changed. And I really firmly believe that, and I want to believe that, and I want to continue to just, I think that we are all going to stand up. So we have a statement. NCR is very happy that the lessons are being appreciated by younger people in Nikkei progressives, and there is a statement and some actions that we want to share. So June and Sean are going to come up.
Okay, yeah. Well, we all know that the passage of the Civil Liberties Act was a huge victory won by a united Japanese American community. And I feel like we should really give a shout out to ourselves and an ovation to all the people here who are part of that struggle, people who have passed on, and people all across the country who are part of this. But our victory in 1988 was not only for our community, it was a victory for all justice-minded people because it forced our government to admit that what it did was wrong, and that the camps was due to racism and a failure of political leadership, and to pay reparations to the tune of $1.2 billion. If you can imagine today our government admitting that it did wrong and making reparations, you can see what a tremendous victory it was.
During the Redress and Reparations campaign, and since winning Redress, many in our community vowed that we would not let what happened to us happen to others. And since Trump's election, we are seeing the same type of policies, the same hatred and racism we faced being promoted at the highest levels, and minority groups are again being singled out and attacked. We see Muslims being banned from entering the country, children being torn from their parents at the border, and families being held in indefinite detention. The parallels with our history are vividly clear. With our parents, grandparents, and grandparents top of mind, coast to coast, we vow never again.
Now, today, we call on Japanese Americans across the country to join together and to pledge to support immigrant communities who face exclusion, just as we were targeted. We stand with the Latino, Muslim, Black, and Asian families who are being separated, detained, and deported by ICE. We call for sanctuary for asylum seekers, not border walls. And we call for compassion and inclusion, not a Muslim ban. Today, we want to put the vow, never again, into action. So we are excited to announce that Nikkei Progressives of LA, Nikkei Resistors from San Francisco and the Bay Area, in partnership with NCRR, Densho in Seattle, the Japanese American Service Committee in Chicago, and New York Day of Remembrance Committee, are kicking off Never Again Is Now campaign to take action. So please take a flyer, this flyer that we have in the back table, so that you can click on the link and learn more about what we're trying to accomplish.
And so this is a call to action, right? So the actions that we would love for you to take and we would ask you to take are to first fundraise for legal expenses and family reunification costs for those affected by Trump's policies. As we all know, that's going to require a lot of grassroots effort because the government's not doing what they're supposed to be doing. To mobilize for rallies, marches, and other support actions so that our voice is heard. To support the Never Again Is Now campaign through art and culture projects that connect the camp experience with today. And to support legal and legislative actions that protect immigrant families instead of sending them to detention centers. We are also asking you to help swing key congressional districts to vote Republicans out of office, and to do public education about civil liberties and know your rights trainings so that you can help those whose rights are being violated today.
In closing, let's remember our rich history of struggle for equality and against injustice. We resisted EO 9066 with legal challenges. In the camps, we engaged in civil disobedience to protest the poor conditions and to protest the loyalty oath. We fought for citizenship rights for our Issei, and in the 60s, we marched for civil rights. We fought for ethnic studies and against the destruction of our communities.
What we learned from the Redress and Reparations campaign is that the Japanese American community, while not large in numbers, has the compassion, influence, and ability to make a difference. We can't be silent. We must speak out, and we must take action. So as we've seen throughout today, there are many people who are not in this space. And what I want us to do real quick is I want us to take a moment to close this out, to bring these people into the room with us. So if you're comfortable with it, I would invite you to close your eyes. Just take a moment to think about the family that is not in this room with you, to think about the family that fought to ensure that we could live the lives that we have now, to think about the activists whose names we've heard throughout the day, to think about the activists who are working hard to ensure that the policies that we're seeing right now do not affect people in the ways that they affected us before. And with that, what we're going to do is when you open, I'm going to ask you to open your eyes, and when you open your eyes, I'm going to say some phrases. I'm actually going to yell some phrases. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to bring all of that energy and all of those people that you're thinking about, I want you to bring them into the room, and I would like you to just take that energy and yell it right back out. Can we do that? Can we do that? Yes. All right. So open your eyes. No ban, no wall. No ban, no wall. No ban, no wall. No ban, no wall, justice for all. No ban, no wall, justice for all. Never again is now. Never again is now. Never again is now. Never again is now. And then on this last one, after we say it one more time, we're just going to start yelling. Can we do that? Can we just yell? Can we just get the energy out of the room? So one more time. Never again is now. Never again is now. Woo! Thank you.
Boy, Sean does that a hell of a lot better than I ever could, you know, that's for sure. Thanks a lot, Sean and June, for that. Thank you to JANM for organizing this and all the various activities to commemorate the 30th anniversary. And I think it's wonderful to have such a facility and the staff and volunteers to really bring this together. And partnering with the Go for Broke National Education Center, which is right across the street. And I think that partnership has really further strengthened, I think, not only the work in Little Tokyo, but I think the kind of collaboration that I think we're increasingly seeing within our community as those of us, you know, see our community under attack in so many ways. And we need some sense of unity and moving forward more than ever. And so I'd like to thank those two organizations and the other sponsoring, partnering organizations, the JACL, the Downtown LA chapter, the JACL National. I know David Kawamoto's here. You're still part of the national structure, right? Oh, Carol is. I'm sorry, Carol. You're the district governor for PSW, Carol Kawamoto. And so thank you for JCL. Kizuna, Little Tokyo Service Center, Manzanar Committee, Bruce is back there. National Veterans Network, NCRR, UCLA Asian American Studies Center, Karen Wang, and Visual Communications. I think Gabriel's around here somehow. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, Gabriel's back there. So I mention these because these are partners that have further strengthened the kind of links between us. And so if nothing else, this sense of crisis has brought together people and organizations under a more common sense of purpose. And within that sense of common purpose, the last thing in concluding the program is we're going to be taking a picture, right?